Hello and welcome to my tutorial how to create art with free tools. In part 4 of the tutorial we will jump into Unreal for environments and lighting. We will start creating the cave for the deers. We will look into landscape sculpting and landscape materials. We will set up materials and shaders for the river and for the deers as well. We'll jump back to generate some simple textures and start tweaking and lighting the scene even better and dressing it more with more details and bushes. Lastly, we will capture a camera sequence. Okay, let's start by typing Unreal Engine into Google, which brings us to the Unreal Engine website, and from there we can download the creator's license. After creating an account, you will have to download the Epic Games software, and under the tab Unreal Engine, you can start pressing the plus button to install your Unreal version. So I'm going to start an existing one, and I'm starting a blank new project with starter content, and I'm calling it Deer Tutorial. So this folder already exists, so I have to rename it to a different folder name. So I'm closing the newly created project and I'm copying all the data that I created with Houdini and Photopea and moving all that or pasting all that into the Unreal project folder now. So as you can see under my project, there's already my Deer Tutorial project. And now I'm going to the Learn tab and I'm looking for the Open World Demo Collection. And I want to add that to my project. This will download some additional files that we can use to dress up the scene. So now I'm ready to start opening the project for good. So as you can see, there's already the kite demo and starter content folder in there. And now I'm dragging the OBJs that we exported from Houdini into Unreal. And I'm just clicking Import All without changing any settings. I'm creating a new folder, My Content, and I move all that there into that folder. And I'm also grabbing the texture file and moving it, just drag and dropping it also into the My Content folder. And all these U assets live in that folder now. So I'm dragging the cave, the deers and the rainbow tube into the scene, and I'm setting the transform location to 0, 0, 0. And then I want to get rid of the pre-existing meshes, the chairs and the floor, and just delete that stuff. Under the Show tab in the viewport, I'm hiding the grid, and in the World Outliner, I'm clicking the eye icon next to Rainbow Tube to hide that as well. Again, I'm just pulling up the concept as a reference. And I'm using the buttons at the top of the viewport to switch between the Move, the Translate and the Rotation tool. And I'm just roughly positioning the deers and then typing in the values 130 and minus 130 on Y, so they have an equal distance from the origin. Under Window Viewports, I'm adding a second viewport and I'm snapping it so I can see two viewports at the same time. And I'm selecting Create a Camera here, Camera Actor. And when I move the viewport, I see that I'm actually leaving the camera. So what I want to do is switch to Game Mode to hide all the icons from that viewport and lower the camera speed so I can adjust the camera position more precisely. In the camera settings, I'm changing the field of view to 100. It's like a wide angle field of view. This is just a very initial pass, so I'm looking for the right values here. Okay, I'm using WASD to position the camera in the viewport, and I'm using the mouse buttons to look around. With Q and E you can pull the camera up and down as well. Okay, now that I'm happy, I'm going to right click on the camera actor, transform and lock the camera in place. this prevents me from accidentally moving the camera in viewport 2. And I'm deleting more files. The player start I don't need. And I'm going to the light source and rotating it slightly, just to get a feeling on how the sunlight interacts with the cave openings. And I can switch to local mode in rotation to get more control over where the shadows, where the lighting comes from. So the position of the light doesn't play a role. It's only the rotation that is driving the sun position. And what I can do is I can right click and pilot that actor in the viewport. So now it's like looking through the light and rotating it into position. And I'm checking the viewport 2 to see the result while I'm navigating in viewport 1. And I changed this light to mobility movable as well. This way it stays real time and doesn't need to be built, because building the lighting always takes a while and I don't want to slow myself down by doing that. So I'm changing the intensity here, and what I want to adjust is the exposure, because currently Unreal is on auto exposure and I'm clicking the min and max buttons to have the same value, and that way the auto exposure is basically turned off and I can see the real light values. I'm dragging in an exponential height fog. Enable volumetric fog and play around with the extinction scale. And I'm exaggerating all of this a little bit, and we can scale it back down later. So fog density, fog height fall off, fog cutoff distance, these are all values you can play with, and since it updates in real time, just tweak the settings until you find something you like. So I deleted the sphere reflection capture node as well. And now I'm navigating to the kite demo environments and I'm setting the filter to static mesh to see all static meshes from that folder. And there's this mountain rock closed that I really like. It's really versatile. I'm dropping it into the viewport and I'm hitting the lock button on the scale and scaling all axes to 15 or 10. Maybe 5, so I went way too big initially. So I'm renaming the static meshes folder to my meshes. And I'm renaming that folder to lighting. And then I just drag and drop objects around to clean up my folder structure a little bit better. Renaming this to scene setup now. Okay, so the only thing I have left is my meshes and scene setup. I want one more folder, placed meshes, because these rocks are not really my meshes, it's just something that I will spam to recreate the shape of the cave. With Ctrl-C and Ctrl-V you can copy and paste and create another one of these rocks. And I'm just freely adjusting the translation and rotation. And try to trace the outline of the holes that let the light into the cave. I want to hide the cave mesh and the rainbow tube mesh for a second. And I want to go to the landscape mode tab, manage and create new. So the default settings are already good, so I'm just hitting create. And then I'm finding the landscape gizmo and the landscape mesh, and I'm just setting the location to 0 in Z, so it actually is on the floor and not floating in the air. And then I continue to arrange the rocks to create the entrance or the exit of that cave. And I just go very rough in the beginning. I don't want to have too many assets. I want to keep it very simple at the start. I like to work in the upper perspective viewport, but I usually look down at the viewport 2 where I can see my camera location, just to see the final result, because I don't really need this rock structure to make sense in 3D space as long as it looks convincing from the camera perspective. Okay, I'm happy with the entrance now, so I'm moving on to create the first hole in the ceiling, and I'm carefully checking the amount of light and shadow that is created, because I don't want the deers to be in the shade, but I would like the shade to act as a vignette in the outer areas of that image. So here you can see very clearly how I use the shadow to capture the focus to the center of the image by darkening the edges and borders of that camera view. Once I'm happy with the light distribution, I'm just trying to improve the silhouette of the hole itself. The tricky part here is the connection between the two holes. I cannot get the right shape by only using one rock to bridge the gap between these two holes. So I really need to use two so I can drive the shape of the silhouette individually. And I scale down the rocks more, use smaller shapes to really get the silhouettes I want now. This looks good in the camera viewport already, but I'm checking the 3D space, the upper viewport as well, for holes in my setup, and I'm just rearranging and scaling the rocks to fill these holes. And now I can go back to the landscape tab, go to sculpt, adjust the tool strength to 0.1, and by clicking in the viewport, slowly start sculpting the terrain higher around the rocks. Just adding more volume to the terrain, adjusting the brush size to create some height variation, and also lowering the parts of the terrain where I want the river to be. I'm using the smooth tool to smooth out the areas that went too steep. Okay, I'm dragging a plane into the viewport, and I'm setting the scale to 100, and I want the Z position to be at 0. So that creates some Z fighting flickering with the landscape. So I'm sculpting the landscape higher or lower wherever I see the flickering. I either want it to be above the river, above the water plane, or below the water plane. And there's also a lot of flickering going on behind the camera. I don't need to fix that, but it's just annoying me, so I'm giving it a quick sculpt where I'm just sculpting the terrain higher to be above the water plane. And then I'm continuing to sculpt the size of the river, referencing the camera view as well, to make good choices where I want the river to be in relation to my camera. In the content browser, I right-click and create a new material, and I'm calling it m_river. The first thing I want to do here is to change the blend mode to translucent, because I want this to be the water of the river. And then I'm selecting a constant free vector and adjust its color to blue. Create another constant free vector and adjust the color to be more greenish. And use a linear interpolate. Plug in the green to A and the blue to B. And drag out from the alpha to create a depth fade. Set the fade distance default to 500. And drag all of that into the base color. So based on the distance to the terrain, from the water surface to the terrain, it turns either more blue or more greenish. And for the output of the depth fade, I want to multiply that by 0.75 and drag that into the opacity. So the opacity is never at 1. I never want the water to be fully opaque. Okay, save this asset. And drag the material from the content browser onto the water plane. We can already see this work, but the opacity is very low, so it's very hard to see in the viewport. Also, I want to disable showing the grid. So what I need here is a Fresnel node. And I want to plug that into the refraction of the shader. But I also want to drag that out into a lerp. And I'm setting the values to 1 and 1.33. I'm using a texture sample. And for the UVs, I'm using texture coordinates. And back on the texture sample, I type water and just pick a nice normal for the water. I change the tiling on the texture coordinates to 50 to see the normal map being tiled a couple of times. And this is already visible in the viewport now as well. It's a very subtle effect because of the transparency, but there are waves on the water now. I'm also changing the depth fade default value to 200 because my water is not really 5 meters deep. 2 meters seems more appropriate. Dragging out from the lerp, I want to create an if statement because I want to create some foam around the shorelines. So I'm using 1 minus x to invert the depth value, and I plug that into the a part of the if statement, and I'm using a constant of 0.95 for the b part of the if statement. And if a is bigger than b, I want the constant to be 1, and if a is smaller than b, I want it to use the lerp. However, I cannot see any of that because the opacity is still too low, so I'm adding some opacity to the shader now. And what this is doing is, if the depth is lower than 5 centimeters, then use a constant of 1 which resembles a white color. Okay, this works. I can also see that the water is getting more blue where the water is deeper. Just playing around with the texture tiling of the waves, make it less frequent. Okay, we can save and close this. Right click, create a new material and call it mDear Wooden or mDear Wood. For the base color, I'm creating a texture sample again and texture coordinates to plug that into the UVs. And then I'm searching for a texture. Also I type pine, bark, and selected diffuse for pine bark. This came with the starter content and the kite demo already, so I did not create that texture myself. I create another constant free vector and color it yellow brownish, because I want to mix that color into the texture sample or into the texture that I just loaded. So to do that, we grab the RGB component, plug it into a lerp, plug the color into the B part, and connect that to the base color. So the diffuse got a lot weaker now already. As you can see, it's a mix between the diffuse and the color. For the roughness, I set the constant of 1. I want this wood to be very rough. And I create another texture sample to pick the normal map for the pine bark and connect that up to the normal slot in the shader. It's very strong, so I'm using another constant free vector, changing the R to 0.5, the G to 0.5, and leave the B at 1. And by interpolating between the normal map and that color, I'm weakening the normal by 50%. So it's less strong now. I can then drag the material onto the deer itself and check it in the viewport. And adjust the tiling of the texture coordinates according to the look that I'm after. So in this case I wanted to tile less. And I want to adjust the color to be a little bit more strong. And I still think that the normal map is too strong. So I'm changing the linear interpolate alpha to 0.75 on the normal map and also on the base color. Okay, this looks much better. There's still some dark areas in the concept, but we fix that with lighting later. For now we just create another material for the abstract version of the deer. Plug in a texture sample, pick the normal map that we have rendered before, and plug in the texture coordinates. I want to plug that texture into the specular as well. And I want to set a constant roughness of 0. So now we can see some nice reflections on the material already. I want to plug in the normal map into the normal part as well to see some nice distortion on the reflection. Save that, drag and drop it onto the deer. And I need to jump back into Photopea to create a rainbow texture for the rainbow tube. So I'm adjusting the blending options on the background layer to use a gradient overlay with the rainbow preset. But I want this to be transparent around the edges to give that lens flare look. So I'm creating a new layer, adding a lot of noise. Choose another filter of motion blur, change the angle to 90 to distort that noise vertically. And then I scale the width of the layer to 400, just to make it bigger. I copy the layer, arrange both of the layers next to each other, merge that down, and use the blur tool to fix the seam. So this creates a tiling texture. I copy that into my clipboard, create a mask for the background, and paste the clipboard into the mask, which already creates a lot of transparency on the rainbow. But I also want to use a black soft brush to completely fade out the upper and lower end of that rainbow. Just slightly adjusting the position of the colors and save that out as a PNG. I can drag that PNG into Unreal and use it on my new rainbow shader. So again, texture sample, pick the texture we just created, plug in the coordinates for the UVs that we created in Houdini, set the blend mode to translucent, plug in the alpha into the opacity, and we already got a very good base material for this already. Okay, let's apply it and see how it looks. Okay, it starts to look roughly like a lens flare on the tube part of the mesh already. But I don't like how it's intersecting hardly with the terrain and the surrounding rocks, as you can see in the lower viewport. So there's a simple solution. Again, I want to use the depth fade between the alpha and the opacity, and I want to set the fade distance default to 200. And apply that. So now I get a much softer transition of that transparency when it intersects with the terrain or the surrounding rocks. I can now scale and translate the whole mesh to better match the shape that I'm after, but I realize I need to separate the tube from the plane. So I'm going back to Houdini. And just plug in the tube part into the output directly. Copy the whole output part of the network. We actually don't need the output nodes, and connect the plane output to the plane only. Don't forget to rename the output of your OBJ to plane, so it's different from the tube, and drag in the new object we created into Unreal. So I drag that, but I want to copy the scale values from the tube and paste it to the plane. So they have the both scale values now. From the content browser, I'm creating a new material. I'm calling it Portal. I want it to be blend mode translucent. This time I want to start with a vector free of a blue color. And mix that with a texture sample. But the UVs need to be plugged into the texture coordinates, of course. So I'm looking for a noise here. Just picking this one for now. We can change it later. Adjust the tiling so I can see the noise on the shader ball. And use a multiply to multiply that noise on the color, and also use that for opacity. Again, we can use the same depth fade node that we used in the other shader to make sure the transition into terrain and rocks is smooth. And I want to multiply the blue color by 0.1 and plug that into the emissive color, so the material is less dependent on being lit. Okay, maybe I can find a better noise here. Yeah, let's try this one. Save. Drag and drop. Okay, this looks alright. I think we can still adjust the tiling a little bit. Maybe try 6. And change the multiply of the emissive to 0. Which effectively turns off the emissiveness completely. Okay, back to the content browser. I create a new material, and this time I want to change something up. This is a landscape material, so what we need to plug in is a layer blend node. And if I click the plus icon on the layers part, I'm creating one layer name called grass, and I add another element that I call pebbles. And these are blend weights. I'm copying that to plug it into the normal as well. And set the roughness to 0.9. So we do this so we can later blend the painting of grass and pebbles directly on the landscape. So I'm using a lerp node. Plug in a texture sample of grass. And for the UVs this time, we need to use landscape coordinates. So this is different from the usual texture coordinates. For the B part of the lerp, I want to plug in a color. And as we did before, this is just to blend the texture with a color. And I'm using an alpha of 0.7, which makes the diffuse part weaker and the green color stronger. Copy the texture sample and find the matching normal map for that texture, or find the matching diffuse. Plug that into the landscape coordinates and hook up the texture sample of the normal map to the layer grass that goes into the normal part. And then we do the same for the pebbles. So layer blend pebbles connects into a texture sample that is reading a pebble texture diffuse. Copy that texture sample and pick the matching normal map. Hook both of them up to the landscape coordinates and connect that to the layer pebbles of the normal map as well. Okay. So let's apply that to the terrain by selecting the terrain and dragging it into the landscape material slot. And then under paint, I choose a new weight blended layer for grass and for pebbles. This creates 2 new files, and we can select the entry now and paint that part of the material, that layer of the material, directly on the terrain. So I'm painting pebbles around rocks and into the river, just to give some variation to break up the repetitive grass. Back on the landscape material, I want to change the mapping scale for that material. So I'm starting with 1, and that doesn't change anything. So I'm setting it to 10, and this scales up the diffuse and normal tiling by the factor of 10. So I'm doing this so my camera can actually see it, and it's more obvious in the video as well. And here I just copy the color and the lerp node to blend the pebbles with a gray color and hook that up to the layer blend. Okay, that works. So I go to build and build lighting only. Okay, and I can see that most of my scene is actually in the shade and appearing very dark. Before I fix that, I just clean up my folder structure a little bit here. And then I select the light source. And I have a bug in my Unreal, so I cannot pilot the light source at the moment. I will fix that later with a restart of Unreal, but for now I just rotate it directly in the viewport. What I'm trying to achieve here is a contrast of light and shadow, where I have a lot of light in the center of my image, but I have some nice dark areas at the borders and edges of my image. Referencing the Photopea, you can see there's like more rocks on the right side of the image, and I can copy an existing rock to position it in such a way that it looks more rocky, but also casts some interesting shadows that kind of close the image on the right side. So this achieves two things. This gives me more detail and also casts some interesting shadows in the outer areas. I'm going back to the light, playing around with the settings we have here, and since it all updates in real time, I just drag the sliders back and forth until I get something I like. I don't have like fixed settings for any of that. That's the beauty of Unreal. It all works in real time. You don't need for the lighting to be rendered. So feel free to play around with that until you're happy. For the skylight, I'm adjusting the volumetric scattering. And for the sky sphere, I'm setting the cloud speed to 0, because I don't want the clouds in the background to always move. I want them fixed in my viewport. Okay, so now it's time for some additional lighting. I'm dragging a point light into the scene. And what I'm trying to create here is some bouncing light around the openings of the cave that lights up the surrounding rocks and exposes their texture and shape a little bit better. Because currently it's just black, purely black, and I would like to bring back some of the details that we lost in the background. I just need to be careful that I don't make it too bright, because I don't want to steal attention from the foreground. So just enough that the textures and shapes become visible. The Photopea is evenly lit. Of course we don't want that, but still I'm trying to simulate like an HDR photo look where the whites are toned down and not burnt out, so I can still see the blue color of the sky, but I can also still see some details in the shadows and don't have too much pure black in my image. Okay, I'm dragging a spotlight now. I still cannot pilot it because I did not restart my Unreal yet. Instead, I'm adjusting the position and the rotation in the viewport, but always referencing, always looking at the lower viewport where I can see the final shot. And I want to create a fill light here that shows the structure of the wood very nicely. And I can switch viewport 2 to game mode, so I don't get all the UI and gizmos blocking my view. And I'm just positioning the light in such a way that it shows the individual branches of the driftwood very well. So I have a nice transition between bright and dark areas in between the branches. I copy the spotlight to light the abstract version of the deer as well. And I'm hiding the rainbow tube for a moment. Okay, I restarted my Unreal now, And I finally can go back to piloting spotlights, which makes lighting much easier. Again, while I'm moving the camera in the upper viewport, I'm always looking at the lower viewport. And the goal for this filling spotlight is to bring enough light to make the deer stand out from the background and to reveal the shape, materials and silhouette of the deer in a nice way. Piloting the light makes me realize it's all upside down, so I'm clicking the little yellow arrow in the transform tab on rotation to set the rotation back to something normal, and then repilot my light again to really make the driftwood branches stand out. With the attenuation radius, I can choose how far the light travels, because I don't want to accidentally lighten up the background as well. I'm just interested in the distance to the deer. Back on the rainbow material, I'm creating a constant of 0.1 and plug that into the emissive part, because I felt that I was missing a lot of rainbow information in the unlit parts of my image. I copy one more spotlight, and this is, I call it the kicker spotlight. So let me do a renaming pass first. The first two spotlights that we created were fill lights. So spot fill wood and spot fill abstract. And the first spotlight I created, I want this to be a kicker for the wooden deer. So the intensity is very high, and I'm positioning that light behind the deer. And what I'm trying to achieve here is to create a very thin but bright rim light on the upper back of the deer to make it stand out from the background. It's like a fake Fresnel as well, but only for the upper part of the deer, because I'm imagining the cave openings letting in some light from the top. I copy that kicker spotlight to do rim lighting for the abstract deer as well. And again, the goal here is to create a thin, bright rim light that separates the deer from the background. Okay, so before and after, there's a huge difference. I want to create one more light to brighten up the areas in the right part of the picture. Again, there was a complete black darkness before, and I don't want too much attention on this empty foreground, but I also don't want it to be completely black. On the global post-process volume, I'm enabling the image effect vignette and set that to 0.4, which darkens the outer areas. And for the white balance, I'm adjusting the temperature to something a little bit more warm. I can also play around with the gamma in the shadows, but that doesn't really give me a great look. Yes, it brightens up the shadow areas, but I'm not a big fan of how washed out the whole image looks now. So this is not a good solution in my case here. So I'm selecting one of the rocks and locate its material And I want to tweak the settings for this rock material. So there are some exposed values already. There's an emissive boost. And there's also a brightness slider. So I'm setting the brightness to 2 here. And in this material I can directly see the difference in the viewport while dragging the slider. And setting it to be more bright exposes some of the details I was looking for. There's still some pure black areas in my image, but it's much less now. So this light was lighting the rainbow tube as well, so I'm moving it somewhere else. And I'm just piloting the light until I'm happy with the light and shadows it's casting. Okay, we get some more brightness on the foreground rocks on the right area now. That's great. I'm unlocking the camera actor, and I'm also copy and pasting a backup version of it. And I pilot this camera actor now to do another pass on the camera position. And once I think that I have improved the location, I reference that with camera actor 2. So in this case I like the new position more, so I can just delete camera actor 2, which was just a backup. Back in the environments folder on the kite demo, I can filter by static mesh and drag one of the bushes into the viewport. And this is the fun part, where I usually just put on some music and enjoy playing around with dressing up the scene. I'm increasing the camera speed so I can move faster, and I'm not shy to change the scale of the assets to better suit my needs. And before I move on copying and pasting more of these bushes, I just make sure they are in the right folder in the world outliner. And as before with the rocks, I reference in the camera viewport but work in the upper perspective viewport. This way I only dress the areas that are also really visible in the camera point of view. I don't need to work on anything else. There are also some bushes growing on the opening of the cave. Sometimes I like to enable surface snapping, but in this case the rocks have such a shape that the surface snapping is causing more trouble than actually helping, so I'm switching that off again and just place everything by hand. When you translate an object while holding Shift, the camera actually moves with the asset. This can be helpful if you want to translate greater distances, but your camera is very close to the object. Be careful not to introduce too much noise that conflicts with the center of the image. As you can see, I'm trying to position the bushes in such a way that they do not intersect directly with the silhouettes of the deers. Going back to the library of the kite demo, I'm dragging in some grass that I can use to dress the foreground of the image. Since the terrain is slightly sloped, I also need to rotate the grass in place. And since scaling up the grass too much doesn't look very convincing, I need to be careful with that as well, and rather create more patches that I place in different areas around the deers. And again, I'm only dressing the areas that the camera can actually see. I don't need to address anything else. Okay, with that we can start unlocking the camera actor and repositioning it one last time before we start capturing the whole scene. And then I go to Cinematics, add level sequence, call it my level sequence, click the green track button and look for your camera actor and add that. So the timeline is currently at 0, so I want to add a key at location and rotation by clicking the small circle button. And then I'm moving the timeline to 150. And back in my viewport, I'm just moving the camera to the location that I want to have at frame 150 and click the 2 keyframes buttons again. And now, dragging the timeline already animates my camera. I can save that and click Render this movie. I like to render PNG passes, and I like to render at 4K so I can later scale it down to full HD. And then I just click Capture Movie. And with that, Unreal creates an image sequence, saves that to your disk, and you can then later turn that image sequence into a video with softwares like Hitfilm Express, for example. That concludes the last part of the tutorial. Congratulations, you have all the tools you need to do the polishing pass yourself on the procedural assets and tweak the scene a little bit more in Unreal. I hope to see you in the next tutorial. Have a good one.